I've started a new channel called Lanila Tales. Please subscribe and watch my best stories there. Link is in the description. The first thing Elias Thorne noticed was not the screaming, not the smoke that rolled across the battlefield like a choking tide, but the fact that his boots were leaking. Both feet squelched with every step, and in that absurd, desperate moment, it struck him that he might very well die with wet socks. War had a way of grinding down the grandness of life until only petty discomforts mattered. That thought might have made him laugh if not for the broken bodies scattered across the plain, human and Silvari alike, lying in silence where moments before there had been thunder. Somewhere in that hellish mess, a wounded figure lay watching him, and though he could not know it yet, that single glance would chain him to a path he could never walk away from. Elias stumbled through the wreckage, dragging his sword behind him like a tool he was too tired to wield. His unit was gone, swallowed in the clash and chaos hours ago. He had fought, bled, cursed, and survived, though his survival felt like little more than an accident. The air stank of iron and smoke, blood soaking into the dirt. He was about to turn back toward the human lines when a movement caught his eye. At first he thought it was just another body twitching in its final spasms, but when he drew closer, he saw silver hair tangled in blood-stained leaves, a crown half broken and lying askew. His heart froze. He knew her face. Everyone knew her face. Queen Liriana of the Silvari, the very figure human soldiers had been told was untouchable, divine, the embodiment of everything they fought against. And here she was, clutching a wound in her side, pale and trembling. For a moment he stood there, torn between instincts. One voice shouted in his mind, "Kill her now, end the war, end her life, become a hero." Another whispered something softer, the voice he hated, the one that reminded him that a woman bleeding on the ground was still just a woman bleeding on the ground. He looked at his sword, then at her eyes. They burned with fury even as her body betrayed her. She expected him to finish it. She would never beg. "Of all the luck," Elias muttered, scrubbing a hand down his filthy face. 30,000 warriors out here, and I trip over the queen herself. Wonderful. Just wonderful. He half expected her to spit at him, and she would have if she'd had the strength. He crouched, still unsure. Killing her would be simple, one swift motion, history rewritten with his hand. Yet the thought of striking her, while she was helpless, felt more like murder than victory. He had seen too much of both already. With a groan, he slid his arms under her, ignoring the sharp protest of his own battered muscles. She hissed in pain, eyes snapping open, pupils blazing like molten silver. "Unhand me, human filth!" she rasped. "You're welcome," Elias said through gritted teeth as he heaved her up. She was lighter than he expected, but every step with her across his shoulders sent jolts of agony through his spine. "If I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this very pleasant conversation, would we?" She tried to push away, weakly clawing at his armor, but she had no strength left. Blood seeped warm against his tunic, reminding him how fragile she was despite the stories of her immortality. He began to walk, boots squelching, breath ragged, each step pulling them farther from the battlefield and closer to human territory. The journey would not be easy. 30 miles of broken earth, enemy patrols, and his own exhaustion stood between him and safety. The first mile nearly broke him. His legs screamed, his shoulders ached, and more than once he considered laying her down and walking away. But every time, he looked at her face. She was unconscious more often than not, but when she stirred, her expression was still proud, still unyielding. It stirred something begrudging in him, something that made him keep walking. At one point he tripped on a root, sending them both crashing into the dirt. He groaned, face pressed into the ground, while she let out a sound that was half pain, half outrage. "Do all human soldiers treat queens as sacks of potatoes?" she muttered faintly. "Only the really special queens," Elias grumbled, pushing himself up. His hands shook as he adjusted her weight again. "And to be clear, I'm more of a mule than a soldier at this point." Despite the blood, despite the ruin around them, she let out the tiniest huff of a laugh before slipping unconscious again. He blinked, surprised, then kept moving. The night fell, and with it came the hunters. He heard them first, Silvari voices moving like shadows between the trees. Elias froze, pressing against the trunk of a half-burned oak. Liriana stirred, eyes flickering open, recognition dawning. She wanted to call out, he saw it in her lips, but she remained silent, perhaps realizing that her people might kill him first and ask questions never. Elias held his breath, sweat dripping down his temple. He knew he could never fight them off. All he could do was hide, shift slowly, one step at a time, until finally, mercifully, the voices faded into the distance. When his legs shook too much to hold her any longer, he collapsed by a stream. He tore strips from his own shirt to bind her wound, cursing the entire time. 30 miles? He muttered. 30 bloody miles with an enemy queen on my back. My mother always said I'd make something of myself, but I don't think this is what she had in mind. Liriana stirred again, lips dry, voice barely audible. Why are you doing this? Elias stared at her, the firelight from his small camp flickering across her pale face. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He did not know how to answer. Because leaving you there felt wrong, he said finally. And because I'm too stubborn to stop now. Her gaze lingered on him, something unreadable flickering in her silver eyes before sleep claimed her once more. Dawn came cruel and gray, but Elias rose again, hoisting her with a groan, staggering onward. Each step was agony, each breath a fight, but he did not stop. He could not. Somewhere behind them, the war still burned. Somewhere ahead lay the human border, where questions and danger waited. But in that moment, all that mattered was the weight of the Queen on his shoulders and the impossible road still to come. By the time the towers of the human stronghold crested the horizon, his vision blurred and his knees buckled. He stumbled through the gates, soldiers shouting, weapons raised, but he barely heard them. He collapsed to the ground, the Queen sliding gently from his grasp as darkness swallowed him whole. Elias woke to the sound of shouting and the cold bite of steel pressed against his throat. His first thought was that he had finally died and been thrown into some particularly unfriendly afterlife. His second thought, more practical, was that he should probably stop moving before the sword shaved his beard off. Blinking against the harsh light, he saw the faces of his fellow soldiers, their eyes sharp with suspicion, their hands gripping weapons aimed at him. Beyond them, half a dozen guards held spears trained on the slumped figure of Queen Liriana, who even unconscious somehow managed to look insulted by the indignity of lying on a stretcher. The commander, a hard man named Darius, stepped forward, his voice booming in the courtyard. You brought her here, Thorn? You carried the enemy queen into our stronghold like some kind of prize pig? Elias tried to sit up, but the sword at his throat dissuaded him. Well, technically, he said with a croak, I carried her more like a very angry, very heavy sack of flour that occasionally insults me in her sleep. Humor had always been his shield, though it earned him only a growl from Darius. The debate in the fortress erupted almost immediately. Some shouted to execute her at once, to cut off her head and end the war with one stroke. Others argued she was a bargaining chip too valuable to waste. The hall filled with voices like clashing blades, anger spilling from every corner. Elias, still weak and half delirious from exhaustion, felt like a man who had dragged a lion into his tent and was now shocked that everyone wanted to kill it. When Liriana finally regained consciousness, she wasted no time reminding everyone of who she was. She sat up on the stretcher, ignoring the spear points near her face, and declared that she was Queen of the Silvari and would not be treated like a common prisoner. Her voice, though raspy, carried a power that made even the guards hesitate. She fixed Elias with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. And you, she hissed, are a fool. Elias raised a hand as if to say guilty as charged. It was not the first time someone had called him that. The humans were baffled by his decision to save her, and the accusations came quickly. Was he a traitor? Had he struck some secret deal with her? Had he lost his senses entirely? Elias defended himself with more honesty than eloquence. She was dying. I couldn't leave her there. Killing her while she bled out on the ground, that's not war. That's murder. His words did little to calm the storm, but they planted a seed of doubt, a hesitation among some of the soldiers who had seen enough death to know the difference. Liriana, meanwhile, seemed amused by the entire ordeal. While her life hung in the balance, she lounged as if she were a guest in an inn, watching the humans argue. When asked to explain herself, she simply smirked. I told him to unhand me, and he ignored me. You may punish him for that insult if you like. Elias groaned, resisting the urge to bury his face in his hands. Even on the brink of execution, she could not resist twisting the knife. Days passed with her confined to a guarded chamber. Elias, to his horror, was assigned to watch her, both as punishment and because no one else seemed willing to get within striking distance of the enemy queen. He spent hours standing by her door, listening to her voice float from within. Sometimes she sang in her own tongue, melodies haunting and sharp. Sometimes she mocked him through the door, calling him mule, ox, or stubborn beast. He responded with equally creative insults when no officers were around. One evening, when the council gathered again to decide her fate, Liriana shocked them all. When the commander demanded she choose an escort for the negotiations that might follow, she lifted her chin and said clearly, I will have Captain Elias Thorne as my bodyguard. The room fell into stunned silence. Darius nearly choked on his own breath. The soldiers muttered outraged, while Elias himself nearly toppled from his chair. Excuse me, what? He said, staring at her as if she had sprouted wings. Liriana's eyes glittered with wicked amusement. You carried me 30 miles through hell, human. You may be insufferable, but you are stubborn, and you did not kill me when you had the chance. That makes you reliable enough to keep at my side. Elias rubbed at his temples, muttering that apparently carrying queens around had become his lifelong profession. The declaration caused chaos. Some soldiers argued that allowing Elias to remain near her was madness. Others whispered that perhaps her strange choice meant she had plans beyond what anyone could guess. Darius demanded to know if Elias had bewitched her somehow. Elias, scandalized, shouted back that if anyone was doing the bewitching, it was her. That drew reluctant laughter from a few men in the chamber, though they quickly sobered when Darius glared at them. In the end, politics forced their hand. They could not risk killing her and sparking retaliation from her people. They could not release her either. Keeping her alive, under guard, and watched by the very soldier who had saved her was the compromise no one liked but everyone tolerated. Elias found himself chained not by iron but by duty, tied to the woman he least wanted to protect and yet could not abandon. Their interactions grew stranger with each passing day. She would sit by the fire in her chamber, watching him pace with weary eyes. Why do you scowl so much? She asked one night. You look like a dog who lost his bone. Elias scowled harder. Probably because I'm guarding the person who tried to kill half my friends, and she keeps making jokes about dogs. She smiled then, a small, unexpected thing, and for once she did not answer. The uneasy truce between them balanced on a knife's edge, a blend of mockery, reluctant respect, and something neither wanted to name. Elias could not shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap far greater than any battlefield, a trap set not by blades or arrows but by the queen's will and his own stubborn refusal to abandon her. And though he told himself he was still his own man, deep down he knew the choice had already been made the moment he lifted her from the dirt and carried her across those 30 cursed miles. Elias had never been good at standing still, yet that was exactly what his new role required. Guard duty, especially for someone like Queen Liriana, was less a matter of vigilance and more a battle of patience. Every day he stood outside her chamber or walked 2 steps behind her, enduring her endless remarks with the stubborn silence of a mule dragging a cart. She, of course, enjoyed every second of it. The first time she ordered him to adjust the firewood in her chamber, she did it with the tone of someone testing whether a dog would fetch. He complied without a word, and she smirked in triumph. The second time she demanded warmer bathwater, Elias grunted that he was a soldier, not a servant, and she laughed so hard it echoed down the corridor. Somehow, in her laughter, there was less malice than before, as though she had discovered a new game worth playing. Elias told himself he did not care. He had survived too many campaigns, too many betrayals, to let the sharp tongue of an enemy queen rattle him. Yet day by day, her presence worked under his skin. She had a way of filling a room with her pride, as though walls and guards meant nothing, as though she still sat upon her throne. The soldiers stationed nearby muttered that Elias was cursed to serve her, that no man could endure the weight of both her arrogance and her beauty without losing his mind. Elias heard them and pretended it did not sting. The first real test came at dusk 3 weeks into his duty. Elias escorted Liriana through the courtyard, where she was allowed a short walk under heavy guard. The air was sharp with the smell of rain, the cobblestones slick. As they turned a corner, Elias caught the faintest glint of metal from the rooftop. He had seen it before, too many times in too many ambushes. Without thinking, he lunged, shoving her against the wall just as an arrow sliced through the air where her heart had been. The shaft clattered against stone. Shouts erupted. Soldiers scrambled. Elias's body moved before his mind caught up, shielding her with his own frame, sword flashing as he barked orders for the others to sweep the roof. Liriana stared at him, her silver eyes wide with shock. For once she was silent. His heart pounded as he searched the shadows, every nerve ready to spring. When the attackers fled and the danger passed, the courtyard filled with chaos. Darius himself stormed into the scene, demanding explanations. Elias spat on the ground, furious. "You cannot parade her about, and not expect blades in the dark," he snapped. "You want her alive, then stop treating this like a stroll through the gardens." His words shocked the others with their boldness, but Darius only narrowed his eyes. Later that night, Elias sat by the chamber door, sweat drying on his skin. He replayed the moment in his mind, the arrow's hiss, the way his body had moved to protect her without hesitation. He hated how instinctive it had been. When Liriana spoke from inside, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, he almost ignored her. "You saved me again," she said. "You mock me every day," he replied, "so it seemed only fair to keep you alive for the next insult." There was silence, then the faintest laugh, not cruel but weary. It was the first time he wondered what her laughter might sound like without bitterness. As days turned into nights, the rhythm of their strange bond shifted. He noticed she no longer called him Neil quite so often, and when she did, it carried less venom. She began asking him questions about his life, about battles fought and lost, about what it meant to be human in a world ruled by endless war. Elias answered reluctantly at first, gruffly, but he found himself speaking more than he intended. She listened, truly listened, her sharp tongue tempered by curiosity. One evening, she confessed something that silenced him. The war, she said, did not begin with hatred between their peoples. It began with a betrayal in her own court, a corruption that spread like poison. She had fought to root it out, but by the time she realized the depth of the treachery, the blood had already spilled too far to be stopped. Her voice trembled just slightly as she spoke of her family, of a brother slain in a coup, of allies who turned to enemies overnight. Elias sat in the dim firelight, his jaw tight. For once, he saw not a queen cloaked in arrogance, but a woman carved from loss. He did not know what compelled him to speak, but he told her he was tired of war too. Tired of burying friends, of watching villages burn, of being told it was all for glory when all it felt like was survival. The silence that followed was heavy, not with hostility but with something unspoken, a fragile thread binding them. Neither of them noticed the shadow at the door until it was too late. A faint creak, a flicker of movement, and Elias's head snapped up. He was on his feet in an instant, sword drawn, flinging open the door to find the corridor empty. But he had seen the retreating figure vanish around the bend, quick and quiet, too quick for an ordinary guard. Someone had been listening. His blood turned cold. When he returned to the room, Liriana was standing, pale but steady. "Someone heard," she said simply. Her voice carried no fear, only certainty. Elias clenched his jaw. He knew what that meant. Secrets were dangerous. Conversations like theirs could be twisted, used as evidence of treachery, used to destroy them both. That night, Elias did not sleep. He kept watch by the door, sword resting across his knees, mind racing with the implications. He had seen betrayal before, but this felt sharper, closer. The thought that someone within their walls wanted them silenced gnawed at him. Liriana did not speak again, but when dawn broke, she stepped closer to him as she passed, her gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. There was no mockery in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement of the danger they now shared. Elias felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a stone. The queen who once called him mule and peasant now trusted him with truths that could topple kingdoms. And somewhere beyond the fortress walls, someone waited for the right moment to use those truths against them. The assassin's arrow had been only the beginning. The accusations came like a storm at dawn. Elias had been dozing lightly outside Liriana's chamber when the pounding of boots rattled the corridor. Soldiers poured in, weapons drawn, faces grim. Before he could rise to his feet, two seized him by the arms, wrenching his sword away. Darius appeared at the end of the hall, his expression carved from stone. "Captain Elias Thorne," he thundered, "you are under arrest for treason." The words struck Elias harder than any blade. He twisted in their grip, demanding an explanation, but the commander only shoved a parchment under his nose. It was a report, filled with his name, his supposed conversations with the enemy queen, his disloyalty spelled out in careful ink. The spy had done their work well. Dragged into the council chamber, Elias stood shackled before men he had bled beside. Their eyes were sharp with suspicion, some with disgust. Darius read the accusations aloud, claiming Elias had plotted with Queen Liriana to betray the fortress, that his protection of her was not loyalty but conspiracy. Elias laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in the sound. "If I were planning treason, do you think I would have done it while half the fortress watched?" he barked. He tried to explain, tried to tell them that someone had eavesdropped, twisted their words, but his protests fell on deaf ears. Liriana sat to the side, her silver eyes unreadable, her wrists bound in chains. When silence fell, she spoke with calm authority. "The captain is a fool," she said, "but he is no traitor. He saved me when he could have killed me. He shielded me from your own assassins. Does that sound like a man seeking my throne?" The chamber erupted into mutters. Some sneered that her defense only proved their collusion. Darius spat that the words of an enemy queen meant nothing. Yet the seed of doubt wavered in the air, a fragile thing not easily cut down. Despite her words, Elias was marched to the cells, iron bars clanging shut behind him. Alone in the damp dark, he pressed his head against the wall and tried to summon the old soldier's calm. But all he felt was fury. He had given everything for the humans, spilled blood until his soul was dry, and this was his reward. His thoughts spiraled with bitterness until footsteps echoed. The door creaked open, and Liriana herself slipped inside, guarded by two reluctant soldiers who clearly disliked the arrangement. "You look comfortable," she said, glancing at the chains around his wrists. He gave her a flat stare. "I'd offer you a seat," he muttered, "but the furniture is book-solid." To his surprise, her lips curved slightly. "I told them you are innocent." "They did not listen." Elias snorted. "Of course they didn't. Why would they believe a queen who wants me as her personal mule?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Someone does not want us speaking. Someone fears what might be uncovered. You think me arrogant, human, but I know the smell of rot in a court. Your people have it too." Before Elias could reply, shouting rang from above, followed by the sharp crack of steel. The guards stiffened. An alarm bell clanged. A soldier burst in, pale with fear. "The fortress is under attack," he gasped. "Not from Silvari. From within." The words chilled Elias. This was no raid. This was a purge. The guards wavered, torn between duty and survival. Liriana acted first, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Release him," she ordered, with such commanding force that even humans obeyed. Elias's chains were struck off. He flexed his hands, then grabbed the fallen guard's sword without hesitation. "Let me out," he growled. The corridors had become rivers of panic. Fires spread where oil had been poured deliberately. Rebels cut down loyal soldiers, their eyes wild with fanaticism. Whoever had plotted against Elias and Liriana was making their move. They ran through smoke-choked hallways, Liriana close behind him, her chains clattering until Elias sliced them off with his sword. She moved with more strength than he expected, her pride a shield against exhaustion. At one corner, 3 assassins blocked their path, blades gleaming. Elias shoved Liriana behind him, parried the first strike, and countered with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose. Steel clashed, sparks flying, until 2 lay dead and the third fled. "We cannot stay," Liriana hissed, clutching his arm. "If they kill us here, the war will never end." He nodded, though his breath was ragged. Together they pushed through collapsing halls, the fortress crumbling around them. Smoke seared their throats, flames painting the night red. At one stairwell, the way was blocked by burning beams. Elias cursed, scanning for another route. Liriana, however, stepped forward, raising her hand. Ancient words spilled from her lips, and the fire bent back as though cowed. For a heartbeat, Elias stared in awe. "So you were holding out on me," he said. She smirked faintly. "You didn't ask." At last, they burst into the night air. The fortress roared behind them, half consumed in flames. But their escape was short-lived. A squad of soldiers, faces hard with betrayal, encircled them. Their leader sneered. "Orders are clear. Both of you die here." Elias raised his sword, exhausted but unyielding. He glanced at Liriana, who stood tall despite her wounds. "Funny," he muttered, "I thought I was supposed to guard you. Looks like you're stuck guarding me now." The circle tightened. Steel gleamed. And then, from the trees beyond, horns sounded. Figures emerged, cloaked in silver and green. Silvari warriors, blades drawn, eyes blazing. For a moment, both groups hesitated, caught between fear and fury. Then Liriana stepped forward, her voice ringing across the battlefield. "He is under my protection. Harm him, and you answer to your queen." The Silvari halted, stunned by her words. The human traitors faltered, fear creeping into their faces. Elias could barely process it. One moment, he was an enemy, the next he stood shielded by the very people he had fought for years. When the clash erupted, it was swift and brutal. The traitors broke under the combined force of Elias and the Silvari, fleeing into the dark. Breathing hard, Elias lowered his sword, his body trembling. Liriana stood beside him, her crown gone, her clothes scorched, but her pride unbroken. She looked at him then, not as a mule or an enemy, but as something else entirely. By dawn, they reached Silvari territory. Elias knew what awaited him there: chains, hatred, perhaps execution. Yet Liriana raised her hand, silencing her warriors before they could strike him down. "This man saved me twice over," she declared. "He will not be touched. He will walk as my sworn protector until I release him." Gasps rippled through the ranks. Elias simply stood there, exhausted beyond words, wondering how his life had twisted into this impossible fate. For the first time, he saw not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of a war fought in shadows, lies, and loyalties torn apart. And he knew there would be no turning back. Elias had never felt more out of place than when he was marched into the heart of the Silvari capital, surrounded by warriors who looked as though they could slice him in half with a flick of their fingers. The city was nothing like the stone and timber fortresses of the humans. Here, towers of living wood twisted into the sky, their branches interwoven to form bridges and halls. The air was alive with the glow of enchanted lanterns, and the streets hummed with voices that fell silent as soon as their eyes landed on him. To them he was the enemy, a human soldier dragged into their sacred court at the side of their queen. Elias could feel their hatred like a physical weight pressing on his chest. Liriana walked with the same imperious grace she had carried even when bleeding in his arms. She ignored the whispers, the gasps, the outright snarls. When they reached the central hall, carved from the trunk of a tree so vast it seemed older than time itself, Elias was shoved to his knees before a council of Silvari lords. They wore robes woven with silver threads, their faces painted with disdain. One of them pointed at Elias with a long, slender finger and demanded his execution. "He is a butcher, a killer of our kin. How dare he stand within these walls?" Elias, weary and sore, muttered under his breath, Nice to meet you too. That earned him a sharp kick in the ribs from one of the guards. Liriana lifted her hand, silencing the hall. He saved my life when no one else would, she said firmly. He carried me through fire and blood. He fought off assassins who would have seen me dead. He stands here not as my enemy but as my protector. Her words sent ripples of outrage through the council. One lord slammed his staff against the floor, declaring that her mind had been poisoned, that no human could be trusted. The argument roared through the hall, voices clashing like swords. Elias remained silent, though he could not help thinking how strange it was to be defended by the very queen he had once been ordered to kill. Finally, Liriana silenced them with a single word. Trial. She proposed a test of loyalty, a challenge that no false protector could survive. The lord seized on the idea, eager to see Elias fail. The council decreed that he would face a champion of the Silvari in combat. If he survived, he would be allowed to remain at her side. If he fell, his death would prove his unworthiness. Elias sighed as he was dragged away to prepare. Of course it's a duel, he muttered. It's always a duel. Can't they ever just ask me to do the laundry? The next day, the arena was filled with Silvari citizens, their eyes burning with anticipation. Elias stepped into the ring with a battered shield and a sword that felt far too light compared to the brute of a warrior who stood across from him. The champion was nearly 7 feet tall, muscles rippling, his armor gleaming like polished stone. He looked at Elias with the kind of confidence that came from knowing victory was inevitable. Elias muttered to himself, "I didn't sign up for elf wrestling," and raised his sword. The clash was immediate. The champion's strikes came down like thunder, each one rattling Elias's bones. He blocked, dodged, stumbled, and cursed, relying on sheer stubbornness to stay upright. The crowd jeered with every misstep, roaring with every blow that sent him reeling. But Elias had learned long ago that strength alone did not win battles. He watched, waited, looking for patterns, for any crack in the champion's rhythm. Finally, he saw it. The champion's strikes, though powerful, were predictable, always overcommit. Elias feigned weakness, staggering back, drawing the larger man in. When the champion swung wide, Elias rolled beneath the strike, slamming the edge of his shield into the man's knee. The giant faltered, just enough. Elias rose, striking with every ounce of fury left in him, his blade biting into the gap between armor plates. The champion fell with a roar that shook the arena. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the crowd erupted into chaos. Some shouted in fury, others in disbelief. Elias stood panting, blood dripping from his brow, his arms trembling. He expected a blade in his back at any moment. Instead, Liriana stepped forward, her voice carrying above the noise. "He has proven himself. He will remain by my side." The council had no choice but to yield. Though they seethed with anger, tradition bound them. Elias was allowed to live, though the glares from the crowd promised his path would never be easy. Later, as he sat in the quiet of Liriana's chambers, nursing his wounds, she studied him with those piercing silver eyes. "You fought like a fool," she said. Elias chuckled dryly. "Story of my life." She tilted her head, her expression softening for the briefest of moments. "Yet you fought for me, even when you had no reason." He shrugged, staring at the floor. "Someone has to keep you alive. Besides, I'd hate to think those 30 miles carrying you were wasted." Her laughter, quiet and genuine, filled the room. For the first time, Elias felt the faintest flicker of something he had not known in years. Not victory. Not survival. Hope. But peace did not come easily. In the days that followed, rumors spread through both kingdoms. Whispers of corruption deepened, evidence of plots on both sides surfacing like rot breaking through the surface. Liriana and Elias pieced together fragments of the truth, realizing the war had been fed not by hatred alone but by powerful hands manipulating both races. Warlords, merchants, and traders who profited from endless bloodshed. When Liriana brought this before her council, they balked. Some demanded more war, others demanded silence. But she stood firm, declaring that she would seek peace, no matter the cost. Elias knew what that meant. It meant enemies on all sides. It meant assassins in the dark and betrayal at every corner. It meant that their strange bond, forged in fire and scorn, would be tested as never before. That night, Elias sat by the window, watching the stars above the living city. Liriana stood beside him, her voice quiet. If we succeed, we end generations of hatred. If we fail, we die as fools. Elias gave a weary grin. Story of my life, he said again. She smiled at him, not with mockery, but with something closer to trust. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time, Elias no longer felt like he was stumbling alone. The queen who once cursed his name now stood beside him, and together they carried the fragile hope of peace on their shoulders. The weight was unbearable, and yet somehow, for both of them, it felt worth carrying. The night before the peace summit, Elias could not sleep. The Silvari capital glowed with its strange, living lights, branches humming softly with enchantments older than any human memory. But beneath the beauty was a tension thick enough to choke him. He paced the queen's chamber like a caged wolf, checking and rechecking the windows, the doors, the shadows in the corners. He knew what awaited them tomorrow, a gathering of human lords and Silvari counselors, enemies forced into the same hall by desperation and politics. He also knew what such gatherings usually attracted. Assassins. Betrayers. Blood. Liriana sat by the window, her silver eyes fixed on the forest beyond. She wore no crown now, only a simple cloak draped around her shoulders. For a moment, she looked almost human in her weariness. You're walking holes into the floor, she murmured. Elias gave a humorless laugh. If holes are the worst of it, we'll be lucky. She studied him, her expression softening in that way that unsettled him more than her sharpest insults ever had. You should rest, she said. He shook his head. I rest when you're safe. Which, in case you haven't noticed, isn't often. At dawn, the hall filled with lords and generals. Humans in stiff armor sat stiff-backed across from Silvari draped in shimmering robes. The air was so heavy with distrust that Elias thought it a miracle the walls themselves did not splinter. Liriana stepped forward with her usual poise, her voice carrying like the strike of a bell. She spoke of betrayal uncovered, of corruption feeding both sides, of how war had been a cage built for profit by a handful of power-hungry men. Some scoffed. Some leaned forward in sudden unease. Elias stood at her side, one hand never far from his sword, eyes sweeping the hall for the glint of steel or the twitch of a crossbow. It came, of course. It always came. The first assassin moved like a shadow, leaping from the balcony with twin daggers aimed for Liriana's throat. Elias reacted on instinct, shoving her aside and meeting the strike head-on. The clash was brutal, his sword deflecting the dagger by inches, sparks flying. He rammed his shoulder into the assassin, sending them sprawling. More followed, bursting from hidden doors and concealed vents, their blades aimed at both humans and Silvari indiscriminately. Chaos exploded through the hall. Screams rang out, guards clashed, and the fragile hope of peace nearly died in the first instant. Elias fought like a man possessed. His blade danced in the firelight, every muscle screaming, every breath ragged. He kept himself between Liriana and the attackers, his body moving without thought, only the relentless drive to keep her alive. An arrow sliced across his arm, blood dripping hot down his wrist. A spear grazed his ribs, forcing a grunt from his throat. Still he fought on. Liriana did not remain idle. She raised her hands, summoning ancient magic that flared like lightning. Vines erupted from the ground, coiling around assassins' legs, dragging them down. Light burst from her palms, searing shadows from the air. Her people saw their queen wielding power not for vengeance but for survival, for unity, and their voices rose in furious battle cries. For a moment, Elias almost believed they could win. Then he saw the warlord. One of the very men they had exposed, striding into the hall with an axe in hand, his eyes blazing with madness. He had no interest in subtlety, no cloak of shadows. He charged straight for Liriana, roaring her name like a curse. Elias moved to intercept, though his legs felt like lead. The clash of steel and iron rang through the hall, and Elias staggered under the sheer weight of the blow. He had faced giants before, but this was different. This was hate given muscle and form. The warlord's strikes came relentless, each one driving Elias back. His shield splintered, his arms shook, his vision blurred. Liriana shouted his name, her magic lashing out, but the warlord's men cut her off, forcing her back. Elias knew in that instant he was alone. His sword arm trembled, his knees buckled, and still he raised his blade. The final strike came like thunder, the axe descending toward Liriana. Without thought, Elias threw himself in front of her. The impact sent shockwaves through his body. Pain bloomed white-hot as the axe tore into his side. He collapsed to one knee, blood soaking through his armor. But somehow, impossibly, he still held his sword. With a roar that tore from the depths of his soul, he drove the blade upward, burying it in the warlord's chest. The man staggered, eyes wide with shock, before crumpling to the ground. The hall fell into stunned silence. The assassins, leaderless, faltered. Guards surged forward, cutting them down or driving them out. Smoke cleared, cries faded, and the dust settled on a scene of carnage. Elias lay on the floor, gasping, his vision dimming. Liriana knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, her voice breaking for the first time. "You stubborn fool," she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Elias managed a grim smile, blood on his lips. "Story of my life," he rasped. "Always getting stuck carrying queens and kingdoms on my back." Her tears glimmered in her eyes, though she blinked them away fiercely. "You will not die," she commanded. "Not here. Not like this." Her magic flared, wrapping him in light, slowing the bleeding, holding him on the edge of life. He felt warmth spread through him, not enough to heal, but enough to keep him breathing. When she rose to face the stunned assembly, she did so with Elias's blood still on her hands. She declared the truth in a voice that shook the hall. "The warlords are dead. The betrayers unmasked? From this day, no more war will be fought between human and Sylvari. A treaty will be written, and peace will be forged in fire." The hall, shaken and weary, could not deny her. Slowly, grudgingly, heads bowed. The war was over. Later, when Elias awoke in her chambers, his body wrapped in bandages, she was there. She sat beside him, her silver eyes softer than he had ever seen. "You are a maddening man, Elias Thorne," she said quietly. He smirked weakly. "And you're a maddening queen. Guess that makes us even." She studied him, then, in a voice filled with rare sincerity, said, "From this day, you are not just my bodyguard. You are my protector for life." Elias closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under, but a small smile lingered on his lips. For once, he felt the weight he carried was not a burden, but a choice. The war was over, the future uncertain, but he had survived. Together, they had survived. And in that fragile dawn, with the queen at his side and hope rising like the first light of morning, Elias Thorne finally believed that maybe, just maybe, peace was worth the fight.